So, so if you say, and what is linear regression? Linear regression is you've got a whole bunch of variables and you've got a bunch of things that might possibly explain those variables. Can you fit some numbers to those explanatory things called regressors? Okay. Well, that's exactly what we have here, right? We've got a whole bunch of brain data, and then we've got potential things that might explain it, namely our features here, which are like run, touch, hold, eat, things like that. Okay, and we want to say to what weights should I assign to these features? Just like in regression, not just like it is regression. You assign weights to your different explanatory terms, your different regressors. You say, okay, well, if I know that celery produces this activation, and house produces this other activation, and hammer produces this other activation, given what I know independently just from going and looking at my trillion-word corpus as to how often those different words co-occur with my set of nouns, so my set of verbs, my features, what weights should I assign to those features so that they actually can best produce neural activation? It's important that you get these two separate sides separately, right? So the relation between celery and eat, taste, touch, push, hold, that doesn't come from the brain data. If it came from the brain data, you wouldn't be adding anything extra to your model. You'd just be sort of like, repeating yourself. This comes from going and looking at a trillion words from Google's scraping of the web. The part that comes from the brain data is the brain data, and then you fit that to your model. So then you can say, okay, even though I never actually measured what the neural, I never actually showed somebody the word eat or the word push or the word run, I can actually figure out, well, what brain activation pattern do I think would have corresponded to each of these different features? So here's what you get for, and it's actually quite interesting. In the next class this was the other reading, the Pulvermuller paper talking about sort of embodied representation of meaning, and we'll talk about that on Thursday. But especially for concrete nouns, there's an idea which appears to have quite a lot going for it, that the representation of a particular meaning literally uses the part of the body that is involved in that. So if I'm representing the word eat, okay, I literally start to activate my mouth-related, the parts of my brain that are related to my mouth. Okay? Now, not only that, okay, there's activation everywhere. So this actually turns out to be part of the sort of motor strip involved in representing tongue and lips. Okay? If you look at the push, you're literally activating, amongst many other things that get activated, you're literally activating the part of your brain that represents your hands. Okay? And run, you actually get some activation related to legs and feet. And many aspects of people's brains are quite different, but the main aspect in which we're actually kind of the same is in these lower level, more sensory motor areas. The more low level an area is, the more there's actually similar things going on across different people. So, my representation of some abstract concept like, university might neurally look very different from yours, okay, but my representation of something like where my foot is, okay, or my hand or my mouth, is going to be quite similar to yours, because we all have these sort of maps in our brain that, at least for the kind of things like, different parts of the visual field or different parts of our body actually have a common structure across people. So this is how they were able to, they did this nice thing of scanning somebody who, trying to decode from somebody who hadn't been scanned before, which is quite a difficult thing to do. It's the fact that there's this commonality across, especially in quite sort of embodied representations, that the fact that that's common across different people is actually a very important source of information for getting the decoding to work. So in fact, if you look at the top line here, this is a particular person who they're calling participant P1, and down here is average across all their people. I think they had 9 subjects. There's a lot of these maps look quite similar to each other. Okay, they actually look very similar to each other. So I mean, obviously they picked good examples. Note that all of these these are very, very, very concrete verbs, right? These are literally, right, if you wanted to sort of, you could sort of say how concrete is a verb, like how easy would it be to mime this verb, right? All of these things you could mime really easily, okay? If I say, you know, please mime the action of, I don't know, planning, right? Well, you might sort of, you know, go like this or something, but you're not really miming planning. Planning is something much more abstract. Okay? So, so these very, very concrete, very sort of relatable to your body sorts of nouns and verbs actually seem to be represented in quite similar ways across different people. So this is what, can you read this text from back here? Okay, so this is how you can actually break down, this is how you can use your model of how these different semantic features, namely the verbs, are related to the nouns to actually predict new stuff. So, so if I take the word celery and I go and look in trillion words and I say, how often does this word co-occur with the word, how often does celery co-occur with eat? The answer is a lot. Okay, so that's represented by this quite big coefficient here, 0.84. Okay, not quite as much, but still a lot. It co-occurs with taste, 0.35. You know, somewhat less with fill, and then they've got 25 words altogether. So if I say, what do I predict will be the neural activation for some word, then I say, well, in this case, celery. Actually, it would be better in this picture if they had a different word, like spinach. Okay? So say you have a different word, like spinach, and you say, well, I know from celery that, eat looks like this, and taste looks like this, and fill looks like this. And I know from going at my trillion words that spinach has a co-occurrence of such and such with each, and co-occurrence of 0.2 whatever with taste. Then I just have to take, say I've got a co-occurrence of spinach of 0.79 or something with eat. I'll just take 0.79 at eat and whatever the co-occurrence was with taste, and just add up all of these activations, and that's my prediction for the new word. So the model, which allows you to extend from stuff that you've actually scanned people on to stuff that you've never scanned people on but you can make predictions about, is this intermediate layer that if you can say, whatever new word you give me, I'm going to relate that to my set of, I'm going to go and look out in my trillion word corpus and see how often does that co-occur with my set of features. And then I can make predictions for this new word based on that, because I've got activations for those features. So it doesn't matter that I never got an activation for the word spinach. I can relate it to stuff that I do know. Okay? Now that's not going to work very well. That's only going to work insofar as the new words are sort of in the same ballpark as the stuff that you've already scanned people on. If I say, well, I've got activations for celery, apple, and lettuce, and you say, okay, how about give me the neural representation of election, you'd say, I don't know. I don't really have much relationship between election and this stuff that I scan people on. Okay? So it has to be, so this allows you to sort of interpolate between things you already know, but it doesn't necessarily allow you to cover a completely different area of language. But it actually turns out to work quite well. So, here's what the predicted activation for celery looks like, and here's what the observed one looks like, and it has a pretty similar overall structure. Here's one for aeroplane, and it has a pretty similar overall structure. So you might think, well, this is great. Okay, they've got 60 words, and we can present someone with any one of those 60 words, and we can look at their brain, and we can figure out which of those 60 words did they actually, were they actually looking at, were they actually thinking about? And that would be, that would be pretty powerful. That would be a lot better than, just having to, remember we were discussing the difference between, choosing between, say, two items like, igloo and hammer, and choosing between some potentially really large set, or, as human beings, we can deal basically with an unlimited set, or it seems like we can. So if they could really if they could really pick, which one of these 60 words were you thinking about, that would be amazing. Okay? That we can't do. Nobody else can do right now. So what did they actually do? Okay? And this, this was still a very, very, very big step forward, but I think it's helpful to see that, oh, well, I already explained this bit, okay, the results. It's helpful to see just how kind of at the beginning stages we are of trying to understand this kind of stuff. Okay? So they can't, and nobody else has been able to actually just take 60 words and say, I'm going to tell you straight off which of those 60 words you're thinking about. Instead, they have what's called leave-2-out testing. Okay? Now, do you remember we were talking about what cross-validation is? Does anyone feel like they want to say what cross-validation is and approximately how it works? Yeah, I didn't think anyone was going to say that. Okay, let me remind you what cross-validation is. Okay, so cross-validation is when you have a training and a testing set, and you want to say, have I found some sort of underlying regularity that is common across the training set and the testing set? So you take your data and you sort of split it up. And you say, I don't want to just sort of learn some aspect of some noise that's in this data or some random idiosyncrasy of this data. I want to find the underlying thing that's true of the world in general. Well, I don't have the world in general, but I do have this data. Okay? So I can at least chop up my data and say, I'm going to learn about some of the data and see if it works on the rest of the data. And if it doesn't work on the rest of the data, then I've probably just learned some sort of idiosyncrasy of this particular piece of data that I happen to be looking at. But if it does work on the rest of the data, then I'm getting some kind of generalization. I'm finding something that's not only true of this stuff, but it's true of that stuff as well. So you take some of your data, you chop it up, you use most of it for training, and then some of it for testing, and then you sort of swap around whichever bit you're using for testing so that you end up eventually all parts of the data get used for testing and all parts eventually get used for training. Well, the most extreme way of chopping that up is called leave-1-out cross-validation, where say you've got 100 items, you say I'm going to use 99 of them for training and 1 of them for testing, and then I'm going to repeat that 100 times, swapping out each time which one is in the testing bit. So that's called leave-1-out. Okay? So leave-2-out is if you, in this case, they've got 60 words, so you say I'm going to use 58 of the words for training and 2 for testing. So remember in the video there was like a choice between 2 things, is it an igloo or is it a hammer? Okay. Well, in that case, they didn't have 60 words. I think they had 10 altogether. But at any given moment, the decoding part was just faced with this sort of binary choice. Is it this or is it that? Okay. Did exactly the same thing with these 60 words, and that actually, that seems like a sort of a come down, right? Oh man, I thought you were going to decode 60 words. You were going to be able to look in someone's brain and say, of any of these 60 choices, which one would it be? And you can't do that, so that's terribly disappointing. But no, this is actually still this was still a big advance, and is actually a very challenging thing to do. Even if you say, I'm going to tell you what 58 of the words were, and I'm only going to leave out 2 of them, and you just have to guess which one's which. Okay? So you have a 50% chance rate. If you were just blindly guessing, you'd get 50%. And they ended up doing much, much better than chance. They got, I think, about 77% correct. So one other aspect of the video, it's a TV video. I mean, they weren't. TV tries to give you a sort of cleaner picture than maybe things really are. So in the particular example that they showed on TV, they happen to get 10 out of 10 correct. In general, you're not going to get 10 out of 10 correct. Okay? So in this case, they got 7.7 out of 10 correct, and that's actually great. That's actually really good. So this is what a leave-2-out testing strategy is. So you remove a pair of words, model remaining 58, predict the neural patterns for the 2 other words, and then see how good that matches to what you actually get out. And the really nice thing is that these 2 words, this means that because as far as the model is concerned, it's never seen these 2 words before. Okay, it gets trained on these 58 words, and as far as the model is concerned, that's the entirety of the universe of words. The only thing that lets the model be able to have any answer whatsoever about these extra 2 words that it hasn't been trained on is precisely because it has some way of relating those new words to the ones it already knows. Okay? And the only way it can relate them is by having this model of the world, in this case this model of the world of language, which it learned from going out into Google's trillion-word text corpus and saying, hey, how often do these words actually co-occur with each other? So, so is that sorry, that was kind of quite a lot of what's going on in this material. It's a very important paper, and it's set the stage for a lot of subsequent work. But it's not. There's quite a lot going on in here. So I know no one ever wants to say I didn't understand this or I didn't understand that. So maybe you could say you could phrase it in terms, I don't think you sufficiently well explained, which is actually probably true, or could you, give extra clarification? But I strongly expect that there's parts of this that could use some extra clarification, and it's my job to do that. So, thank you.
I just have a question about homonyms. Or something
Ah,
like that. So you said
okay.
saw before was one of the words that weren't in there, and then the list that had words that were together, it was C and C's, but saw wasn't there.
Yes, thank you. Very, very, very important point. I'm sorry, I totally forgot to follow up on that. Right, so just for anyone who doesn't know, homonym means words that, I want to make sure I get this right, words that sound the same but have different meaning. So, so saw is a perfect example. So if I saw the person in the room, or if I pick up a saw and chop some wood with it, those sound the same. In fact, they actually spell the same, but they have completely different meanings. And this is one of the many, many things that makes language difficult. Right? There's lots of things that make language difficult. Another one is the synonyms, that you can have different words that mean the same thing. You can have, that was the example of if someone is trying to figure out is there a traffic jam on the I-95, they might type traffic jam, they might type road delay, they might type road work, they might type backup. Okay, they're really all trying to say the same thing, but they're using different words. So we as language users don't even notice how easy it is for us to figure out that these all mean the same thing. We don't even notice. In fact, they probably didn't notice. Probably the reason, I bet. This is, I think, probably what happened, or you'll have to ask the researchers. They probably, if they had thought at the time, oh, saw actually has this extra meaning, I don't think they would have used it as a stimulus, okay? Because they're trying to pick stimuli that work well. They weren't trying to deal with these kind of difficult problems. But by the time someone said, oh, hey, that saw also actually, is as well as being this thing that you pick up and use as a tool, there's also the past tense of the verb see. They were like, oh man, I wish I hadn't used that, but we've already done all the scams. So too late. Okay, but luckily it didn't really matter too much. And in fact, it was actually even worse because one of their verbal semantic features was actually see. Okay, so then when you go out, into the trillion-word text corpus and you say, give me different. Very well spotted, Megan. Thank you so much. Give me different. Tell me how often the word cat appears with run. You say, okay. Well, I want to make sure that I use run, ran, and all the different forms of the word. Well, you can't use see, sees, and saw, because a lot of the times when the word saw appears, it's not I saw the cat. It's I went to Home Depot and bought a saw. Okay. So the co-occurrences with that meaning of saw would give you completely the wrong answer. So so this is actually another area of understanding the brain's representation of language that we do not have a good handle on yet, okay, at all. So it's fair to say that if it's a concrete noun that has a single well-established meaning, that doesn't have some sort of weird overlap with a completely different meaning that just happens to be the same word, then we have an okay understanding of how it's represented, meaning that if you give us 60 of them and you just leave 2 out, then we can do way with much better than above chance which of those 2 you're actually looking at. Okay, but But if you have the true complexity of language, or even if you just get a little bit more complex, and you have words that might mean different things, then it gets much, much more difficult. So saw is actually a very good example of that. So an example of the kind of sentence that that it's really hard for a computer to understand, and it's kind of easy for us to understand. Or it seems easy, but actually there's some very clever stuff going on in their head that we don't really understand what it is. You may have heard these two examples. So one sentence is, time flies like an arrow, right? You all know what that means, okay? Another one is, fruit flies like a banana, right? So the structure, the overt surface level structure of these two sentences, time flies like an arrow and fruit flies like a banana, look like they're exactly the same, but everything is different, right? And it even takes a little while. I mean, it's a nice example because it even takes a little while to like, oh, man, everything really is different, right? So the meaning of flies is different, right? In one case it's a verb, time's flying. In another case it's these little insects. The meaning of like is different. Like is a really difficult word, okay? In one sense, it's this sort of, simile of, one thing is similar to something else. Time is like an arrow. Another one, it's like another one, it's have a desire for eating bananas. Okay? This is very, very difficult. It doesn't feel difficult to us, but it's very, very difficult. Two aspects of it are difficult. One is to understand how could we make computer systems that can understand these two sentences. Another that's difficult is how on earth does the brain manage to figure out these meanings, and how does it represent these meanings? And the unsatisfactory answer to that is we don't know. I mean, people are trying to figure this out. Yes?
So the cadence is completely different in those two sentences. When you said them first, I was like, but that doesn't make any sense. And it's because you said the cadence is like
right,
the same
I tried to, no,
rhythm.
That's a very good point. I was trying to say them in the same way, because if I say, time flies like an arrow, and fruit flies like a banana, right? You're really picking up on very important aspects of language. So we give each other a lot of cues, so in cadence or prosody, or basically how my voice is going up and down as I say it. But if you just see these words typed on a page, you don't have any of that, right? So,
but when you're reading something, you don't read it word by word by word. Your brain skips ahead, so you then inform
absolutely,
the cadence.
You're absolutely right. So this is you're saying very, very insightful things about language. So yeah, so in fact, you're absolutely right. So yet another way in which the brain does something very smart that we don't fully understand, in which when it's processing language, is it takes language in big chunks. Okay, so if you're sending a text message to someone and you're trying to type it quickly, you can leave out a bunch of words or a bunch of letters and they'll still understand what you mean. If the person on the other end is a computer, they might get very confused by what you mean. Okay? But we understand with some stuff left out, because we're somehow getting this sort of bigger picture, bigger unit of meaning. And in fact, we don't even often notice that there's words missing out. This is one of the reasons why proofreading is really difficult. You write something and you read it, and it looks absolutely fine, and then later you're like, oh, I missed out the word the, or I repeated this word here, and you just don't even notice it, because now why does your brain not? If your brain was actually just taking in this word, then this word, then this word, then this word, then if you have the word the twice, you would totally notice, right? But our brains don't do that. They just sort of skip ahead. They take in these bigger units, which is a very, very efficient thing to do if you're trying to read a whole bunch of text, but which is difficult for computers to do that. And as to how our brain achieves that, people are trying to figure it out, but they don't know very well. Yes? No, thank you so much. There's no such thing as asking too many questions.
So also, have they done anything where they test different languages to find underlying neural representations? Because if you take something like airplane, that's fairly multisyllabic, right? And then if you take it in French, it'd just be vélo. And then, but that can sound a lot like the word arrow in English. So
right.
Have they done that? Said, okay, well, these same areas are kind of
right. So this is a very interesting question. So one thing, well, there's a couple of studies. So one study that a few people have done is take people who are bilingual and look at their brain activation for when they're thinking about, say say they speak, French and English, and you've got airplane and avion or whatever the French is, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So can you figure out if you know their neural activation to when they're thinking about the English word, can you figure out their activation in the same person's head because they're bilingual from looking at the French word? Okay. Or so that's and the answer is you can to some degree. And there's another question that actually I looked at. I haven't finished analyzing this data of if you have different people and they're thinking about the same set of words that have the same set of relations within their own languages, and you try and match up that set of relations, can you figure out which word in which language corresponds with which word in the other language? So yeah, these are some questions, but all of these. So people have started to look at this. Remember, like when we were talking about with the project, typically when you start to look at an area, you'll see, people have looked at quite a lot of things. And the first couple of things you think of, it will turn out that people have looked at that too. And that's not a bad thing. That means actually, that's a good thing. That means you're thinking along the right lines. Okay. So for instance, you say, here's what people know about words. How does this relate in different languages? That's an extremely interesting question. So interesting that other people said, hey man, we've really got to do this, and just within the last couple of years some people have done that. Okay, so this is very fresh. But once you start to get to that point, then you'll start to say, well, hang on a minute, there's still a lot of things that it takes a little bit of sort of poking around before you get to the point where you see, oh man, there's a lot of things that we haven't even touched. So you look at this for a while and it really starts to jump out at you. Well, these are just individual words, right? Language does not consist of individual words. Language consists of sentences, phrases. So a very key open question that there's actually a grant that me and some other people are working on in a minute is how are words represented in the context of broader sentences? Okay. That's totally unknown at present. I really like your point about how a lot of information in speech is conveyed by things like prosody, by actually sort of changing your intonation as you speak. Somehow, if you were to try and write down, some recipe for here's how you extract the information about the structure of a sentence from the way someone's voice wobbles up and down when they're saying it, that's really, really, really hard to do. So people are trying to look at that. People are trying to understand how the brain does that. And this actually is one of the things that sort of has clinical relevance as well, because there's disorders such as, say, autism and others that are actually characterized by having a very flat intonation. So people, high-functioning autistics might be able to speak quite well, understand quite well, but they can sometimes. It's very variable. They can sound a little bit like, sort of like robot speaking. Everything seems like the same tone. Okay? So what's going on there? People are trying to figure that out too. So there's lots and lots of open questions. But this was a big step forward. This Tom Mitchell work, and probably, I would say that probably the key thing to get from this is this idea of representing the relations between words. Okay? So it's not just that they got, here's the activation for cat, here's the activation for igloo, here's the activation for dog, but they also had a model that helped to tell them, oh, well, cat is actually much closer in meaning to dog than it is to igloo. Okay? And that model allows them to generalize beyond the set of words that they were given to new words by plugging them into the same model. So that's probably the most important thing to realize. And then probably the other most important thing to realize is how, this is a big step forward, but it's incredibly step zero. This is as much as people know about the brain's representation of language, but it's single words that are concrete, and that's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of language. But still, it's a lot bigger fraction than we had before. So what we're going to talk about on Thursday is, and this was the other reading, the Pulvermuller paper, the Trends in Cognitive Science paper, is this sort of big question of, where does this relationship between meaning and the world come from? Well, that's a huge question, But for very, very specific sort of concrete things like running or eating or pushing, you can say, oh, well, they're related to how you use your body. And our brain is in control of steering our body. So if you were to represent words about kicking and running by activating, you know, the neural representation of your leg and feet, that wouldn't be such a bad way of representing that meaning. And that's called an embodied view of meaning. And that probably captures a decent chunk of these very, very concrete words. There's a lot more to language than these very, very concrete words. So, you know, a very open and interesting question that a lot of people are working on is, can you sort of take that as a starting point and kind of capture more of language? The answer is nobody knows at present. Yeah. So, so language is, you know, I and many other people find language fascinating. But if you want to ask this question of, you know, where is machine learning and fMRI coming together more than anything else, is I would say, you know, check out the work of Tom Mitchell, who's the chair of machine learning at CNU. I think this is just you know, an exciting direction that the field's going in. So, okay, so on Thursday we will talk more about this embodied stuff and more about different ways of decoding meaning. And I'm still in the process of replying to some of your sort of project mini summaries, and a couple of you requested meetings. If you would like to meet with me, you know, send me a note. And I actually haven't even replied to all of you who've done that yet. I apologize. And we'll try and shoehorn it in because that's you know, it's my job to help you through that. And do not worry at all if you know if you're kind of finding it difficult and you're like, I need some help, because that's my job. So you don't think like, you know, the meeting is just for me, you know, to tell me how wonderfully everything's going. You know, then you probably don't need to meet. So anyway, so look forward to seeing you on Thursday. That paper that we looked at, is it understandable? Yeah, it does look really good. Okay, well, we should chat soon about that. Yeah. But you know.
I'll try and send you the prediction.
Okay, sure. Okay.
Monday.
Okay, cool. And you know, if you're looking, you know, and this thing, if you're looking at it and you're like, oh man, this is great, I can code this up and we can do it. You know, that's wonderful. But if you think, you know, that would be a bigger long-term project, you can just lay the groundwork for it.
No, it seems like that.
Yeah, that's completely fine. And I would be very interested in doing that. You know, so, but don't worry, you know, because I'm just going to turn this on. Tomorrow.
Yeah.
This is going where we keep when we have lunches and stuff. Yeah, like you guys want to do.
Yeah.
Okay, so here.
Yeah.
This would be nice to go.
You need a
That's really good.
it's the same data, it's been data from last forced labor.
Where do you guys get the food